you've been involved in, I guess initially, you had no intention of becoming, a kind of a lightning rod for, right? Of course, you were at University of California, Irvine. You were in charge of the medical ethics department or program, and you lost your job because you took a stand. I mean, I encourage others to look back at some of our earlier interviews and to kind of learn that story a bit more. Today, you're kind of in the midst of everything again with being one of these private plaintiffs on the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit. Where are things at?
Well, to me, the issue of government-sponsored censorship, and even censorship by large, extraordinarily powerful private entities like social media companies, even if they're doing it on their own and not at the government's bidding, both of those things are happening, actually. And I think that issue of censorship is so vital, and the First Amendment free speech rights are so vital right now, because where are we at? I think we're at a hinge point, Jan, in the sense that there are two paths that we may go down, and it's not yet been determined, not yet been decided which direction that this country and other Western nations are going to move in. One direction would be in a direction that is totalitarian in spirit, let's say, in the sense that we would end up in a place where we're ruled by technocrats, by so-called experts, most of them unelected, working for public or private or quasi-private entities that are publicly funded.
Public-private partnership is the favorite term now, right?
A kind of corporatist, right? The melding of state and corporate powers is corporatism, or another word for that literally is fascism. That was Benito Mussolini's definition of fascism, is the merging of state and corporate power. So moving in that direction, where basically an elite group of supposedly enlightened sort of Gnostic elites decides what direction history is moving in and where things need to be going. And that's a society that I think most Americans don't want to live in, but we've already moved some way in that direction, I would say, certainly in the last 4 years, but even in the last 20 years, beginning, I think, with the War on Terror and the Patriot Act, and then building on that with the threat of terrorism first, the threat of danger to public health and safety. These things have been used as a fulcrum, as a kind of lever to increase the powers of surveillance and control by means of digital technologies, by means of financial instruments, increasing centralized power and control over people's lives. And with censorship, you get to the point where you build a system that is capable of sustaining lies, that is capable of sustaining ideologies and obstructing anything that would question that ideology, not allowing certain ideas, not allowing certain questions, not allowing evidence that might contradict this regime to ever emerge into public consciousness. And if that is done with a sufficient level of intensity, that system is perfected, it becomes really impossible for people to find sources of information, to track down dissenting opinions or ideas. And it becomes virtually impossible for those ideas to spread when most of the communication is happening online. So in this major ruling from the Fifth Circuit Court, which was reviewing the injunction that the district court had placed against the government, basically the court was telling the government, you have to stop pressuring social media companies through coercion or even through what the law calls significant encouragement, which also violates the Constitution. You have to stop coercing or even significantly encouraging social media companies to censor content that is protected by the First Amendment. And the government appealed that decision to the Fifth Circuit Appellate Court. The 3-judge panel in the Fifth Circuit upheld that injunction against the government, they ruled that the White House, the Surgeon General, the CDC, and the FBI were clearly in violation of First Amendment rights when they pressured social media companies, that even before the case goes to trial, even at this very early stage of discovery, plaintiffs have already presented enough evidence that those 4 agencies, and likely more, that were named as defendants, were engaging in unconstitutional behavior, violating the highest law of the land, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, that they needed to stop. And I trust that eventually this case will end up at the Supreme Court in terms of the final ruling, if not the injunction. And eventually we'll have a landmark-setting case at the Supreme Court, which will hopefully set a precedent that will push back on government overreach and government attempts to operate a kind of Orwellian ministry of truth.
You're, of course, a private plaintiff on this Missouri versus Biden case. So I just wanted to hear, what does it mean to you personally?
Well, it means a lot to me, not just because I was personally censored for information that turned out to be true, is now vindicated, is widely accepted, is endorsed by the CDC and other, mainstream public health
Which
agencies.
information is that, by the way?
So I was censored on things related to natural immunity for COVID. I was censored on concerns about safety and efficacy of vaccines, which have turned out to be quite legitimate and supported by plenty of research. I was censored for my ethical opinions on vaccine mandates. The first time I was censored was a conversation I had with an independent journalist who actually got fired by her employer for that interview, after having that interview. So that profoundly affected her life. She was fired. The interview was taken down off of YouTube. And what's interesting about that interview is I was not discussing any safety or efficacy issues related to the vaccines. I was just discussing ethical issues related to vaccine mandates. It was just an ethical analysis.
Which, by the way, I'll just mention, is your expertise.
Exactly.
Is what you teach.
At the time, I was the director of the medical ethics program at the University of California, Irvine. I was on the Orange County Healthcare Agency's vaccine task force. I had expertise to speak on the issue of the ethics of mandates. So they were censoring not just scientific information or information claiming to argue different scientific viewpoints. They were censoring philosophical arguments about ethics and about public policy. So it's important to me as a kind of confirmation that not only were the social media companies doing this to me, but they were actually doing this to me at the direct behest and under the directives of the federal government, who was clearly violating my constitutional rights. But it means even more to me because we recently petitioned the court to convert this to a class action lawsuit, which means the 5 of us private plaintiffs are now not just representing ourselves who were censored, we're representing all Americans who were censored under this regime. And I'm very happy about that. I'm very proud to be a stand-in for anyone who doesn't have a public voice, who doesn't have a microphone, who is not being interviewed by journalists like you, to represent their interests, the people that feel powerless in the face of the censorship leviathan, the people who were hammered, where censorship affected their small business, where censorship affected their ability to share information, where censorship affected their ability to share their political opinions. And it's those folks that I think need a voice out there. And I'm very happy that the 5 of us private plaintiffs are able to represent all Americans who are affected by this censorship leviathan.
Well, it's somehow to me fitting that, in your role as, running this medical ethics program at UC Irvine, you felt compelled to enact those ethics as you would teach them and ultimately get fired by not following the vaccine mandates that were imposed on you. And now you are in a position where you have a platform to once again teach ethics through not just theory, but action.
Yeah. Well, God's providence is very mysterious. So it's humbling to be here having this conversation with you. It's humbling to be part of a case that probably will go down as a landmark free speech case in United States history. And I'm glad our case is bringing attention to the issues. I want to also thank the Twitter Files journalists, my friend Andrew Lowenthal, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Paul Thacker, and others who have done great work on the journalistic end to draw attention to what Schellenberger calls the censorship industrial complex. And I think it's going to take journalists, it's going to take legal action, it's going to take people talking around the water cooler and sharing this information with their friends and colleagues to fight this battle, not just in the courts, but also in the court of public opinion. Both of those are equally important right now if we're going to start dismantling this censorship regime. And I think we have a large segment of people in Western nations who are questioning things now that they never questioned before after their experience of what happened during COVID, which is a good thing. I think some people are emerging from that fog and saying, hey, wait a minute, I used to never question what came out of the CDC or the integrity of our public health agencies or the integrity of other federal agencies. But now I'm wondering if there's some corruption going on there. And I'm wondering if what I've been told is the science is actually trustworthy. So I think that's a good thing. I think some people, a significant segment of people, I don't know how many or what percentage of the population, has been chastened by the disaster of our COVID response. And I think it's time now for those people to recognize that, okay, the problems that we saw over the last 3 years go well beyond COVID. Missouri v. Biden, the private plaintiffs were mostly initially focused on COVID censorship because that's what we were censored on, COVID-related content or content challenging the government's preferred pandemic policies. But what we've uncovered on discovery in that case is, first of all, there are many more federal agencies involved in this censorship machinery than we initially thought. So we were focused on public health agencies initially, like the CDC or the NIH, and the White House and the Surgeon General. But now there's at least a dozen federal agencies that have been named as defendants in this suit. And they range from the FBI and other security agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, to even the Treasury Department was involved in censorship. The Census Bureau was involved in censorship. And the range of issues where the government was censoring the speech of Americans online goes far beyond just dissidents challenging COVID policies to basically, you could take almost any contentious political issue in American public life, from foreign policy issues like our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Ukraine war, to monetary policy, which the Treasury Department was, you challenge the Fed's monetary policy, you might have been censored by the government, to gender ideology, to abortion, highly contentious issues of great public importance in American life. The government was engaged in putting its thumb on the scale and controlling what could and could not be said online. I think Americans need to realize that this has been happening, to wake up to it and to recognize that, okay, sorting through a complex sea of information is a difficult problem, but this can't possibly be the right solution to that problem.
A number of people have flagged for me that we're seeing the beginnings of a messaging campaign similar to what happened at the beginning of COVID. Mm-hmm. Talk about the need to have some kind of mask mandate. Some institutions have started that again. What are you seeing right now?
There are certainly rumblings now, and I think there are trial balloons going up to see if the powers that be can reassert, again, more level of control over micromanaging human behavior, from masks to vaccine mandates to some of the other things that we saw during the pandemic. I think there's less public willingness now to go along with those things. I think there's a lot of people who are at least saying, we'll see what they do, but they're at least saying now, I complied with that in the past. I regret having complied with that. I'm not going to do it again in the future.
And a number of institutions have actually, put in the mask mandate, and a few days later, like,
withdrew it. Yeah.
right?
So I think the solution to this now has to be behavioral, right? It's not enough just to say that you're not going to comply. You actually have to not comply. You have to, walk into the, public space, and when you're told to wear a mask, just simply and flatly refuse. And, the old lunch counter sit-in of the civil rights movement. No, I'm not going to move. And, you could send in the police in here to arrest me if you want. But you're going to have to use force to either, make me put this thing on my face or remove me from this place where I belong just like everyone else.
And it seems like such a small gesture again, right? This is what, we've been talking about this, right, during this interview. It's just a small gesture, right?
Yeah, that's right. The refusing to move to the back of the bus, the refusal to leave the lunch counter. Any one or another person who participated in that movement in that way knew that my one gesture alone is not going to accomplish anything. And my one gesture alone could easily be crushed by the powers that be. But they had enough trust in their fellow members of society and the others in this developing movement that, no, I'm not going to be the only one. I'm not going to be standing alone. And so my one small gesture of just, this one ordinary individual does in fact matter. And I think people need to develop that confidence today and that trust in one another that what ordinary Americans do, in fact, matters very much. And if a sufficient number, it doesn't have to be a majority, just a sufficiently strong minority simply refuses to comply, these kinds of authoritarian measures will disappear, almost immediately, actually, because there is just insufficient force to crush everyone in the resistance. If it's just one or another dissident here and there, we can take them out. We can fire them. We can silence them. We can censor them. But if it becomes 5, 6, 7, 9, 10% of the population, game over.
Well, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Dr. Aaron Kheriaty and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed that last episode, you should check out our new documentary, The Unseen Crisis, Vaccine Stories You Were Never Told. And you can find it at unseencrisis.com.